Okay, ready to dive in. Today, we're tackling something pretty important, something that's not talked about nearly enough, and that's emotional exhaustion in autistic adults.
Yeah, it's definitely something we need to shed more light on.
Right, like we all get tired,
Yeah.
right? But this is way beyond just needing a nap or a good night's sleep. It's this feeling of being completely drained, like almost all the time.
Exactly. It's like your battery's constantly running on fumes.
Yes. And for autistic adults, there's like these specific reasons why it can be so tough. So to really get into this, we're looking at this blog post called Cheap ABA, The Silent Epidemic, Adult Autism and Emotional Exhaustion. And one thing that really hit me was that the author talks about being misdiagnosed with depression, but it turned out to be this like really intense emotional exhaustion.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that misdiagnosis happens way more often than people realize.
Right. Like the symptoms can look similar, so it's
Yeah.
easy to see how that happens.
Absolutely. You see fatigue, trouble concentrating, changes in sleep patterns. But the thing is, to really deal with emotional exhaustion, you've got to look at the root causes.
Okay, so let's get into those root causes. Why are autistic adults particularly susceptible to this kind of burnout?
Well, just imagine navigating a world that wasn't really designed for your brain, you know?
Yeah, I can see how that would be exhausting.
That constant effort to adapt, it takes a huge toll. Take social masking, for example.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
It's like this pressure to hide your natural autistic traits, to fit in, even if it doesn't feel right.
It's like you're always on, never really able to just relax and be yourself.
Exactly. And that performance, it leads to some serious emotional fatigue.
And then you add sensory overload on top of that. The world can be so overwhelming with all the lights, the noise, the textures.
Oh, absolutely. It's like a constant assault on your senses.
Yeah, so it's no wonder so many autistic adults feel like they're constantly on edge.
It's like you're always in fight or flight mode. Your nervous system is just going haywire.
And some recent research even suggests a link between sensory processing and the autonomic nervous system.
Really? That's interesting.
Yeah, so it seems like for some autistic folks, their autonomic nervous system might be more reactive.
So there could be a biological component as well.
It seems that way, which, adds another layer to understanding why this exhaustion can be so debilitating. But it's not just sensory overload and social masking, right? We also have to talk about executive function.
Oh, absolutely. That's a huge piece of the puzzle.
So for our listeners who might not be familiar, can you explain what executive function is?
Sure, it's basically those mental processes we use for things like planning, organizing, managing time, even regulating our emotions.
Okay, so kind of like the control center of our brains.
Exactly, and these can be areas of real challenge for autistic individuals. Imagine trying to navigate a world that demands constant planning and multitasking. When those skills are already so draining for you, it's a recipe for burnout.
That makes total sense. And even simple things like managing a to-do list or switching between tasks can take so much more energy.
Oh, absolutely. It's like your brain is working overtime just to keep up with everyday life.
And then there's very little energy left for anything else.
Exactly. And remember, executive functions also play a key role in managing our emotions. So when those skills are a struggle, it can be harder to regulate those feelings effectively.
Wow, so it's like this combination of social masking, sensory overload, and executive function challenges, all coming together to create this, like, perfect storm for emotional exhaustion.
It's almost like a vicious cycle, each challenge feeding into the others.
Yeah, and I think it's important to acknowledge that, some of our listeners might be thinking, okay, this is sounding really familiar.
Oh, definitely. And if that's you, you're not alone at all.
Right, and the first step is recognizing those patterns in yourself. That's huge for understanding why you're feeling this way and finding ways to manage it.
Absolutely. Awareness is key.
So let's shift gears now and talk about what you can actually do about it. Because even though the challenges are real, they're not insurmountable.
Right. There are things you can do to take control.
What are some strategies for coping with emotional exhaustion, especially when it's tied to these, unique aspects of the autistic experience?
Well, let's start with the foundation, and that's self-care.
Ah, self-care.
Yeah, I know some people might roll their eyes.
Like, oh, here comes the bubble baths and face masks again.
Right, but for autistic individuals, self-care is so much more than that.
It's about, like, really understanding your needs and creating a life that supports them.
Exactly. It's about intentionally designing your environment, your routines, even your social interactions, to minimize those triggers that lead to exhaustion.
And I imagine that looks different for everyone.
Oh, absolutely. It's not one size fits all.
I remember the author of our blog post talked about creating a sensory haven at home. I love that idea. What would that look like in practice?
Well, think about the sensory experiences that bring you comfort and calm, like maybe it's soft lighting, the weight of a heavy blanket, the sound of rain.
I could see how that would be so soothing.
Right. Intentionally incorporating those elements into your space can create a sense of peace, and it can really help regulate your nervous system.
So it's not just about avoiding overwhelming situations. It's about proactively building in sensory experiences that help you recharge.
Exactly. It's like a two-pronged approach.
That makes so much sense.
And another key self-care strategy is prioritizing activities that genuinely bring you joy. And I emphasize genuinely, not what you think you should enjoy, but what truly lights you up.
Yes, that's so important.
Like for some autistic adults, it might be highly focused activities like model building or coding. For others, it might be spending time in nature, listening to music, or being creative like photography or writing.
It's about finding those activities that allow your mind to fully engage, to
Hi.
get into that flow state where you lose track of time.
Exactly. Tapping into those passions and allowing yourself to fully immerse.
So it's about giving yourself permission to prioritize what brings you joy,
Ah.
even if it doesn't fit the typical idea of relaxation.
Exactly. It's about what works for you.
Now, beyond creating a supportive environment and prioritizing those joyful activities, what other self-care strategies are important for managing emotional exhaustion?
Well, one that often gets overlooked but is absolutely crucial is setting boundaries.
Boundaries. Yeah, those can be tough.
They can be tough for anyone, but especially for autistic individuals. There might be that strong sense of obligation or a fear of disappointing others.
And social expectations can be so confusing. Like sometimes saying yes feels like the right thing to do, even when you know it's going to push you past your limits.
Exactly. It's about learning to recognize your own internal signals and honoring them. Maybe you need more downtime after social interactions than others, or certain environments are just too overwhelming. Learning to politely decline invitations or requests that don't align with your needs is a form of self-preservation.
Like putting on your own oxygen mask first.
Exactly. You can't help others if you're not taking care of yourself.
Okay, so we've got self-care through curating your environment, engaging in joyful activities, and setting those firm boundaries. But what about when you're already feeling that exhaustion creeping in? What can you do in those moments?
That's where mindfulness practices can be incredibly helpful.
Mindfulness. I know.
Things like deep breathing exercises, progressive muscle relaxation, even short meditation sessions, they can all help calm your nervous system and ground you in the present moment.
I've tried meditation before, but I always struggle to quiet my mind. Any tips for people who find it hard to sit still and just be?
Absolutely. Mindfulness isn't just about sitting in silence. It can be about focusing your attention on any sensory experience. The feeling of your feet on the ground, the taste of a cup of tea, the sounds of nature. It's about shifting your attention away from those racing thoughts and worries and just grounding yourself in the here and now.
I like that reframing. It doesn't have to be this big formal practice. Even taking a few minutes to focus on your senses throughout the day can make a difference.
Exactly. Little moments can have a big impact.
And there are so many resources out there now, like apps, guided meditations, even YouTube videos. It's easier than ever to find a mindfulness practice that works for you.
It really is. There's something for everyone.
Now, along with those individual strategies, I think we need to talk about seeking support. Because while self-care is essential, it doesn't mean you have to go it alone.
Oh, absolutely. Building a strong support network is so important for managing emotional exhaustion.
And that could include friends, family, a therapist, even online support groups.
Exactly. It's about finding those people who truly get it.
And I think those online communities can be especially helpful for autistic individuals,
Yeah.
who might find in-person social interactions draining.
Yeah, it's a way to connect without having to mask or expend a lot of social energy.
Right, and those groups can offer a wealth of shared experiences, tips, and resources.
You might learn about new coping strategies, discover sensory-friendly products, or simply find comfort in knowing that you're not alone in this.
And going back to our blog post, the author also talked about the importance of seeking accommodations, both in the workplace and in educational settings.
Oh, that's so important, but I think a lot of people hesitate to do it.
Yeah, it can feel intimidating to ask for what you need.
Absolutely. But remember, it's not about demanding special treatment. It's about creating an environment where you can thrive.
Right, like flexible work hours, a quiet workspace, extended time for assignments, or sensory-friendly lighting and acoustics.
Exactly. Those things can make a huge difference.
But how do you even begin to advocate for those accommodations? It can feel scary, especially if you're worried about being seen as difficult.
I understand that, but I think the key is clear communication and framing your requests in a way that highlights the benefits for everyone.
So like instead of saying, I need a quiet workspace because I get overwhelmed by noise.
You could say, I find that I'm most productive when I can focus in a quiet environment. Would it be possible to explore options for a workspace that minimizes distractions?
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
It shifts the focus from your challenges to a shared goal of productivity.
And I think it highlights how important it is to know your rights. There are laws in place to protect people with disabilities, including autism, from discrimination.
Absolutely. Knowing your rights is essential for advocating for your needs effectively.
And remember, there are organizations that specialize in disability rights and advocacy. They can provide guidance and support if you need it.
So many resources out there, you don't have to navigate this alone.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground from creating a sensory haven and prioritizing joyful activities, to setting boundaries, practicing mindfulness, seeking support, and advocating for accommodations. It's a lot to take in, but the key takeaway is that there's so many tools available.
It's about finding what works best for you, what brings you that sense of balance and well-being.
Exactly, and that might take some experimentation and self-discovery.
And most importantly, be kind to yourself throughout this journey.
I love that reminder. There will be good days and bad days. There will be times when you feel like you're making progress and times when you feel like you're taking two steps back.
That's just part of the process.
It's about being patient with yourself, celebrating the small victories, and remembering that you're not alone.
You've got this. We believe in you.
So before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to touch on something that I found particularly interesting.
Oh, what's that?
Well, while reading through the blog post, the author mentioned something called autistic burnout. And I have to admit, I'm not really familiar with that term.
Yeah, it's something that unfortunately not many people are aware of.
Could you maybe explain a bit more about what it is?
Sure, it's basically like a state of intense exhaustion. But it's not just emotional, it's physical and mental as well.
Wow, that sounds really intense.
It is, and it can happen after prolonged periods of stress and trying to cope in a world that doesn't always understand or accommodate autistic needs.
So it's like emotional exhaustion, but amplified.
Exactly, and it can involve things like a loss of skills, increased sensitivity to sensory input, even difficulty doing everyday tasks.
That sounds really serious.
It is, and it often goes unrecognized, which is why it's so important to talk about.
And it makes you realize how crucial it is to address those underlying systemic factors that contribute to burnout.
Absolutely. Things like lack of support, inaccessible environments, societal expectations that don't account for neurodiversity, all of that plays a role.
Which brings us back to those strategies we've been discussing. Self-care, boundary setting, seeking support. They're not just Band-Aid solutions, they're about building a life that truly supports your well-being.
They're about creating a foundation for long-term resilience.
I love that, a foundation for resilience.
And it's important to remember that this is a journey, not a destination. There will be ups and downs, times when you feel like you're thriving, and times when you feel like you're barely keeping your head above water.
I think a lot of our listeners can relate to that feeling of barely keeping afloat. What advice would you give to someone who's in that place right now?
Well, first and foremost, be kind to yourself. Recognize that you're doing the best you can in a world that isn't always set up for you to succeed.
That's so important.
And remember that seeking support is a sign of strength, not weakness.
Reaching out can make a world of difference.
It really can, and sometimes the most important step is acknowledging that you need a break. Giving yourself permission to rest, to step back from overwhelming situations, to prioritize your own needs.
That can be so hard to do.
I know, but it's essential.
And that's where those mindfulness techniques we talked about can come in handy.
Oh, absolutely.
Taking a few minutes to focus on your breath, to engage your senses, to just be present in the moment.
It can help reset your nervous system and give you a much-needed pause.
It's not about adding another thing to your to-do list. It's about finding those small moments of respite throughout your day.
Exactly. Those little moments can be incredibly powerful.
They allow you to reconnect with yourself, to tune into your body's signals, and to make conscious choices about how you want to move forward.
And that's what it's all about, taking back control.
So as we move into the next part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with this thought. Emotional exhaustion in autistic adults is complex, but it doesn't have to define your life.
It doesn't have to be a life sentence.
By understanding the underlying causes and equipping yourself with the right tools, you can create a life that feels more balanced, fulfilling, and authentically you.
You have the power to create the life you want.
And remember, there's a whole community out there ready to support you on this journey.
You are not alone. Okay, so we've talked about autistic burnout, like what it is and why it's so important to address it.
Yeah, it's definitely a heavy topic.
It is, but I think it's important to remember that there's hope.
Right, like it's not a hopeless situation.
Not at all. There are so many things you can do to manage emotional exhaustion and prevent burnout.
And a lot of those strategies we talked about in the first part, like self-care, boundary setting, seeking support, those are all essential for building that resilience we were talking about.
Absolutely. They're not just quick fixes. They're about creating a foundation for long-term well-being.
So let's dive back into those strategies and maybe explore some more specific examples.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so we talked about creating a sensory haven at home, but I'm wondering if you could give us some more concrete ideas for what that might actually look like.
Sure. Think about the sensory experiences that bring you comfort and calm.
Okay, so like what kind of things are we talking about?
Well, for some people, it might be having soft lighting in their home, like using lamps instead of overhead lights. Or maybe it's having a cozy corner with a weighted blanket and some soft pillows.
Oh, I love weighted blankets.
Yeah, they can be really grounding, especially if you're feeling overwhelmed or anxious.
And what about sounds?
Sounds are huge. Maybe it's having a white noise machine or playing nature sounds.
Like rain or ocean waves?
Exactly. It's about finding those sounds that help you feel relaxed and focused.
And scents too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Aromatherapy can be really powerful. Maybe you have a diffuser with calming essential oils like lavender or chamomile.
It's like creating a little oasis of peace and sensory harmony.
Exactly. It's about intentionally designing your space to support your sensory needs.
Now, what about those joyful activities we talked about? Can you give us some examples of things that might bring autistic adults joy?
Sure, it really varies from person to person, but some common ones are things like spending time in nature, listening to music, engaging in creative pursuits.
Like painting, drawing, writing,
Exactly. Or maybe it's something more hands-on like woodworking or gardening.
or even playing video games.
Yes, video games can be a great way to de-stress and get into that flow state we were talking about.
That state where you're totally absorbed in the activity and you lose track of time.
Exactly. It's like a form of mindfulness.
And I think it's important to remember that it doesn't have to be something productive or useful in the traditional sense.
Right. It's about what brings you joy, period.
Now, let's talk about boundaries. We touched on this earlier, but I think it's worth diving a bit deeper.
Definitely, setting boundaries is crucial for preventing burnout and managing emotional exhaustion.
But I know it can be really hard, especially for autistic folks who might have a strong sense of obligation.
Or who might worry about disappointing others.
Exactly. So how can we get better at setting boundaries?
Well, I think the first step is to recognize that it's okay to say no. You don't have to say yes to everything, and you don't have to please everyone all the time.
It's like giving yourself permission to prioritize your own needs.
Exactly, and it's about learning to communicate your boundaries clearly and assertively.
So, like, how do you actually do that?
Well, it might be something as simple as saying, I'm not able to do that right now, or I need some time to myself. You don't have to give a long explanation or apology.
Just be clear and direct.
Exactly. And remember that you have the right to say no without feeling guilty.
I think that's something a lot of us need to hear.
It's a process, but it's worth it for your own well-being.
Okay, now what about those moments when you're already feeling overwhelmed and exhausted? What are some things you can do in the moment to kind of bring yourself back down?
That's where those mindfulness techniques can be really helpful.
You know, like deep breathing exercises, progressive muscle relaxation, things like that.
Exactly. Those techniques can help regulate your nervous system and calm your mind.
And we talked about how mindfulness isn't just about sitting in silence, right?
Right. It can be about engaging your senses in a mindful way.
Like paying attention to the taste of your food, the feeling of the sun on your skin, the sound of the birds singing.
It's about bringing your attention to the present moment and noticing those sensations without judgment.
And I think a lot of people might be surprised to learn that there are actually different types of mindfulness practices.
Oh, absolutely. There's walking meditation, eating meditation, even mindful movement.
Like yoga or Tai Chi.
Exactly. It's about finding a practice that resonates with you.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about seeking support. We mentioned this earlier, but I think it's worth emphasizing again, because it can be so hard to reach out for help.
It can be, but it's so important. Having a supportive network can make a huge difference in managing emotional exhaustion and preventing burnout.
And that support can come from different places, right?
Absolutely. It could be family, friends, a therapist, a support group,
Even online communities can be a great source of support.
especially for autistic individuals who might find in-person social interactions draining,
Yeah, it's a way to connect with others who understand what you're going through.
and to share experiences, tips, and resources.
And I think it's important to remember that seeking support is a sign of strength, not weakness.
Absolutely. It takes courage to reach out for help.
Now, the last thing I want to touch on is accommodations. We talked about how important it is to advocate for your needs in the workplace and in educational settings,
Mm.
but I'm wondering if you could give us some specific examples of accommodations that might be helpful for autistic adults.
Sure, some common ones include things like flexible work hours or breaks, a quiet workspace, noise-canceling headphones, fidget toys to help with focus.
Those are all great ideas.
And in educational settings, it might be things like extended time for assignments, alternative testing formats, or access to sensory-friendly spaces.
And remember, it's your right to ask for these accommodations.
Exactly. There are laws in place to protect people with disabilities from discrimination.
And there are organizations that can help you navigate the process of requesting accommodations.
So don't be afraid to speak up for your needs.
So, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with this message. You are not alone in this journey.
There's a whole community out there ready to support you.
And remember, there is hope.
You have the power to create a life that feels more balanced, fulfilling, and authentically you.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into emotional exhaustion in autistic adults, I keep thinking about how much we've covered and how important it is to keep this conversation going.
It really is an ongoing conversation, and there's always more to learn and understand.
Exactly. And I think one of the key takeaways for me has been just how much of a silent epidemic this is.
Yes, so many autistic adults are struggling with emotional exhaustion and burnout, and they often feel like they're alone in it.
Right? And that's why it's so important to talk about it, to raise awareness, to break down those stigmas.
And to create a more supportive and understanding environment for autistic individuals.
Absolutely. And I think we've, provided some really practical strategies and resources. Things like self-care, boundary setting, seeking support, advocating for accommodations.
Those are all essential tools for managing emotional exhaustion and preventing burnout.
And I hope our listeners feel empowered to, start implementing those strategies in their own lives.
I hope so too. And I think it's important to remember that. This isn't about being perfect or having it all figured out.
Right. It's a process. And it's okay to make mistakes along the way.
Exactly. And that's where self-compassion comes in.
Being kind to yourself, recognizing that you're doing the best you can.
And giving yourself permission to rest and recharge when you need it.
And if you're feeling overwhelmed or like you're struggling to cope, please reach out for support.
Don't be afraid to ask for help. There are people who care about you and want to see you thrive.
There are therapists, support groups, online communities, so many resources available.
And remember, you are not alone in this.
So, as we close out this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a message of hope and empowerment.
You are strong, you are resilient, and you have the power to create a life that feels good for you.
And we believe in you. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into emotional exhaustion in autistic adults. We hope you found it informative and helpful. And we'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration into the world of autism.